What do you think is the percentage of non-technical roles that Google hires for? Surprisingly, it's probably a lot higher than you think. It's probably about half. In today's video, I want to focus in on three core areas that are going to help you crush these non-technical Google interviews. We're going to start by doing a screen share and looking at a little bit more of the distribution of how Google is hiring for their jobs today. So we'll go through that for a little bit. Then we're going to dive into, well, what are the most common types of interviews for non-technical roles and what do they focus on? And then lastly, we're going to just uncover just a few basic strategies for success. So let's dive in. Let's go into that part one, which is distribution, and I'll share my screen now. So I thought it would be fun to start by looking at the distribution of total job openings. And so if you have a premium LinkedIn account, you can go into Google or you can go into any company and see what LinkedIn is capturing from a job openings perspective. So I basically clicked on every single area. So you'll see all these areas. They're not all going to fit on the screen. But let's go ahead and start to hover over and look a little bit at the breakdown. So if we click here, engineering, 25%, not a surprise. Then we go to information technology, which is really random. We don't really know what fits in there, but okay, now we're at 35% of technical roles. Now when we go to program and project management, that's another 10%. That's going to be a little bit of a mix of technical, non-technical, arts and design. Now that could be more on the technical end for people on the UX side who get very technical, but that's a very small percentage. Now biz dev, are you going to need to understand technical concepts? Yes, but we would put that 5% in non-tech. Finance, we're definitely putting that in non-tech. Human resources, another 2% non-tech. Legal, 2% non-tech. Marketing, 6% non-tech. Media and communication, 3% non-tech. Ops, mostly non-technical, 4%. Now product is interesting because product is largely going to have a technical component these days. Now product marketing manager, not so much. So maybe about half of that is non-technical at 3%. Then we get into research. Research, usually non-technical. Sales, obviously non-tech, but you could get a sales engineer who has some technical knowledge, but maybe not a background in engineering. So that could be a little bit of a hybrid. I'd say most of that 8% is going to be non-technical. Support, that's going to be a mix of tech and non-tech. And then we have this other section as well. But what you can see from these openings, and again, this data is not going to be 100% accurate, but what you can see from this data is there's quite a distribution and there are quite a few roles that are going to fall in that non-technical space. And it's really important to remember that in sales or human resources, in any of these roles, you're going to have to learn some technical knowledge in the space, but this is foundationally talking about people who have not grown up in tech, don't have an engineering degree, etc. I hope that screen share helped. Let's dive right into part two, types of interviews. There are three core interviews that Google will focus in on for non-technical roles. That's RRK, which stands for role-related knowledge. There's GCA, which stands for general cognitive ability, and there's GNL, which stands for googliness and leadership. Let's chat about all three. So for the RRK interview, this is going to be largely domain specific. We're going to cast a wide net with the average range of questions, but about 4 to 7 questions is what I want you to expect, both hypothetical and behavioral questions. And this is where the job description and recruiter are going to be absolutely critical. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the third part of this video. What's really important to remember is you're interviewing for a specific position that likely has similar skills for similar titles across all industries. So what am I getting at? Research is going to be so critical to your success because we can do Google specific research and then we can just understand what's critical to success in a marketing role or a sales role or any other non-technical type of role. Now, for the GCA interview, GCA is really focused in on problem solving. The most typical number of questions is 3. So we usually start with two hypothetical. I want to start there because the behavioral question, there'll be two hypothetical, one behavioral, and sometimes that behavioral is asked, sometimes it won't be. On the hypothetical side, usually one random question that is not role specific, like asking a marketing manager to open a pastry shop, and then one that's probably more role focused, like asking a salesperson how they might increase a client's spend with Google. The most critical item, and you're going to hear me speak and use that word critical a lot, is to wear the hat of the role. So solving with the role in mind will make things a lot easier for you, and it will also bring your interviewer into the conversation and help them pay attention more. So if we get a random question, let's not go away from the role. Secondly, using the CFAST method. This is about planning, preparation, practice. CFAST stands for clarify, framework, assumption, solution. This is a very big topic, so I'll put some videos in the YouTube description to help you with that. Now, on the behavioral question, usually with this one behavioral question, it's more of what I like to refer to as a catch-all question. So what that means is you can likely bring in or discuss a very big example. It's usually about enhancing something, handling unexpected results, but you are going to be able to dive deep. The biggest difference is they'll ask you follow-up questions, and the most common follow-up question to a GCA behavioral question is, what would you have done differently? And you should have multiple items that you could have done differently. This really shows your learning approach. Okay, on the G&L side, they're going to be largely focused in on leadership and just doing the right thing. Similar to RRK, it's cast a wide net, 4 to 7 questions. Again, this is really going to depend on your interviewer. Similar to the RRK interview, this is going to be a mix of hypothetical and behavioral, but what we've seen is a little bit of a lean towards behavioral questions. And I really like to focus and think about both sides of the coin. Essentially, what I see a lot of in these interviews is the negative questions, which are unethical, conflict, questions about a negative culture, and then positive questions, questions that get you to focus in on great leadership items like mentorship, sticking and pushing your own decisions, inclusivity. Inclusivity will be a big part of these interviews as well. And continue to wear the hat of the role when answering questions. These are the most common interviews for non-tech, but there's a few others that we should highlight. The presentation interview, very common. Case study interview is also very common. And let's throw another one in there for program managers, like a cross-functional interview, which is not going to really show up in a technical interview for a technical role. So the presentation interview typically is based on something real or fictional. It really depends on the role. Sometimes it can depend on the hiring manager, but there's two keys to success here. A very clean and clear deck, and thinking about speaking to a wide audience. People that might fully understand the subject and people that might not be as close to that subject. And lastly, practicing that presentation. My recommendation is with at least 5 different people of varying skills and backgrounds that are going to give you all sorts of feedback, not only on what you say, but the presentation and the overall deck. And this will absolutely make that interview go much more smoothly because you will be way more confident if you practice it with others. Now, the case study interview is conducted in a couple of different ways. First, Google provides the scenario up front before the interview and lets you prepare. This scenario is getting way less common just because of leaked data and information getting out there. But in this case, you know exactly what to focus in on. You go in with a planned answer and approach, and you set it up much like the presentation interview. You practice with others, you just make sure you have a plan. Now, what seems much more common in 2022 is that you're given the case study question at the beginning of the interview and allotted time to come up with your plan and answer, typically about 15 minutes. It will typically be an hour interview. They'll give you 15 minutes and 45 minutes to go through it, or 45-minute interview, 15 minutes to prepare, a half an hour to go through it. And in order to be prepared for this scenario, this case study interview the day of, pre-plan. So for a marketing role, you might be starting to think about the critical items to think about, like a launch, creating a marketing plan, both. For sales, you might be thinking about items you need to close a client, gain a client, improve a client relationship. The case study is going to be incredibly role specific and should not be random or feel random. And you can pre-plan and make sure you're going to have success in that one. Now, lastly, I just wanted to highlight and throw another one out there in the cross-functional interview. Again, this is very common for program managers, and it's pretty similar to the RRK interview. It's just going to be a little bit more of a lean on collaboration and working with others. These are just a few examples. There's all sorts of other non-technical interviews, but these are the ones I wanted to focus on with you. All right, let's dive into part 3, basic strategies. We've covered a lot of these items before, but I just want to reiterate. Let's just kind of start off by saying what we need to say. There is simply less data for these non-technical roles, and we need to utilize all the tools at our disposal. And some of these tips are really basic, but critical for your success. Let's start with the job description. We have talked about this item extensively, especially in the live sessions, but since there is less data, let's put the focus here. So first things first, just copy and paste that JD, we're going to call job description JD, into a Google Doc and start with the about the job section. This is where Google always starts. And typically in sentence 2 or sentence 3, you're going to start to see some specificity about the role pop up. And that's when you're going to start highlighting. You're going to start highlighting the critical themes, the critical keywords throughout the job description. You should find multiple critical items in the about the job section. Then as we move on to the responsibilities section, really start to think, okay, why would they list these items? Typically 3 to 6 items. We're going to want to look through all those items. There is not a single item in there that is not super important to your success. So make sure you're spending a lot of time in the responsibilities and just highlighting all those items and double clicking and making sure that you have those skills or you're learning some of those skills or improving those skills before the interview. Now the qualifications section, minimum and preferred, this is where we're looking for just a couple of nuggets. We're looking for a couple of nice pieces of data that we can pull out. In the minimum qualifications, sometimes it's nothing, but sometimes that last bullet especially will have a couple of important data points. The preferred tends to be more specific and have a little bit more data, and it does focus in on typically technologies or systems. And so even for non-tech, we live in a technical world, so we're going to have some of that knowledge, have some of that information available to us so we can bring it up in the interview. Now the last piece with the job description and a missed item is question creation. If you look statistically out there online, they say about 50, 60, 70% of the interview questions can be found in the job description. And I would agree with that. So let's go right back to that marketing role, for example. A common item in marketing is your ability to influence. Actually, let's say marketing and sales. So if we think about ability to influence, we can create some really simplistic questions to practice. Tell me about a time you influenced someone to see things your way. Tell me about a time you were unable to influence a critical stakeholder. Now let's flip to a hypothetical question. How do you influence others to see things your way? Or I want you to imagine you're unable to influence a critical stakeholder. What steps would you take to win them over? And this is just one small concept. There are so many questions we can create out of the job description, and that should be part of your practice strategy. Now let's talk about your recruiter. Your recruiter is the source of truth. But so often I get questions from the general public that they're in the interview process with Google that they need to be asking their recruiter. And you can take control by asking a number of questions. I just want to highlight a few that I like when we're really thinking about the interview. I ask about 30 questions of the recruiter if I'm in the job process, but here are a few. What are the most critical skills needed to have success in this role? Are there any themes or areas where candidates are falling short and or doing well in these interviews? Can you tell me more about the focus areas of the interviews? Can you tell me more about what the breakout of the questions that will be asked in these interviews? Do they like to ask behavioral? Do they like to ask hypothetical? A mix of both? You can even go as far as, when you're going through these interviews, hey, what do you know about Sue, Jane, or Bob? What types of questions do they like to ask? Doesn't mean you're always going to get the answer, but we have to be asking our recruiter these questions. The last item, and we talked about this a couple times, we have to practice with other humans and your technical counterparts. So think about a software engineer, for example. They are absolutely practicing 50 times, 100 times with other engineers on their coding skills or system design skills. So why are us non-technical people not doing the same thing? And what you want to focus in on your practice is really domain specific and then more collaborative and soft skills based. And I can't put enough emphasis on this. I think our technical counterparts are doing better because I've definitely grouped myself in the non-technical group. So when interviewing at an elite company like Google, make sure you're practicing. Good luck.